Today, my name's Adam White. I'm a research fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Johnson Center, the Hoover Institution's outpost in Washington, D.C. This is part of a series we've had for a few years called Opening Arguments, Conversations on American Constitutionalism. The idea being that the Constitution isn't just the things that are discussed in court. The Constitution doesn't just belong to judges, it belongs to all of us. We all need to take this seriously in terms of self-governance and the preservation of constitutional institutions. And so it's always a real pleasure when we can bring into the discussion people from Capitol Hill, our elected leaders, to think about and talk about the ways in which they see their role in our constitutional governance. And for those of us who study the Constitution, we go back over and over again to the Federalist Papers, where the framers really expected Congress to be truly the first branch of government. You know, James Madison said in Federalist 51 that in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And he says in another paper, Federalist 48, he goes a little bit further and says the legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. Things are a little different now. Congress doesn't draw everything into its impetuous vortex. It doesn't draw much into itself at all. If anything, Congress seems to do more and more to sort of hand power out to other parts of our government. And so it's a real pleasure to introduce Congressman Mike Gallagher, who in a short time on Congress has already established himself not just as a leading voice within Congress, but also a voice outside of Congress, writing and speaking on Congress as an institution. Congressman Gallagher represents Wisconsin's 8th District, the northeastern part of the state, which includes his hometown of Green Bay, Wisconsin. After graduating from college, he served in the United States Marine Corps for 7 years on active duty as a counterintelligence and human intelligence officer and regional affairs officer for the Middle East and North Africa, eventually earning the rank of captain. He deployed twice to Iraq's Al-Anbar province as commander of intelligence teams and served on General Petraeus's Central Command assessment team in the Middle East. He also worked in the National Counterterrorism Center and the Drug Enforcement Agency before serving as a Republican staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Commission. Now, as an elected official, or elected representative, and he was elected for the first time in 2016, he serves on the House Armed Services and Transportation and Infrastructure Committees. So obviously you're very busy in your work on Capitol Hill, and we appreciate your time. And all this really began, it was inspired by an article that you wrote last November titled, How to Salvage Congress. So let's start with an easy question. How do you salvage Congress? But also, how to salvage Congress and why? What is the problem with Congress, and what's the path to reform?
Well, thank you for that softball right there. But thank you, Adam, for inviting me, and thank you guys for showing up. Thank you for reading that article. I spent a lot of time. I knew that it was better than my normal work when people started asking me if I actually wrote it myself, which I did. My staff now refers to it as my Jerry Maguire memo. Sort of, who's coming with me? And then no one follows. So I think the problem is twofold. Well, let me illustrate the problem with what I just voted on an hour ago. So we got a notification maybe at most 12 hours ago. We had our main show vote yesterday, which was on the DREAM Act, but then we got a notification saying, I'm not actually checking text, I'm pulling up what the notification was, that we're going to be voting today on the Ocean Acidification Innovation Act of 2019. Maybe it's a good bill. I don't know. Maybe we have some experts on ocean acidification in the room. I did my best to triage it. I have a great staff that did their best to analyze it to the extent possible. We never really had any sort of debate on the House floor about ocean acidification, whether our research is working or it isn't working. Similarly, our vote on the DREAM Act yesterday, there was perhaps 3 hours of debate on the bill, but it was just people on both sides reading talking points. There was no give and take. There was no back and forth. People had already came into the debate with their talking points ready to go. And so I think that is illustrating that we have some problem in Congress, that this is not actually a deliberative body, that it has become, I think, as was best explained by Yuval Levin, rather sort of a way for members to get famous and to increase their profile. So why is that the case? What is the problem? Well, I see two problems. One that you alluded to, really for the last 5 decades. A lot of this stuff starts in the 70s with the Watergate babies, who had a lot of well-intentioned attempts to claw back authority from the executive branch that in almost every case, I think, backfired, and then accelerating in the 90s under Republicans with some of the Gingrich reforms. Congress, and really continuing consistently ever since, Congress, through a series of actions, has surrendered most of its constitutional authority to the executive branch, and we put most of the government on autopilot. So that's one thing. But I think the less understood phenomenon is the way in which power within the increasingly powerless institution has gone from the committees and the individual members and has been tightly concentrated at the top. Now, you had the opposite problem, as I understand it, and trying to do research on this, where there was a point in time when committee chairs had too much power and they were there for life and they controlled everything. I think we sort of, with the creation of the Modern Steering Committee in the 70s, the way in which Gingrich further empowered the Speaker in the 90s, we've overcorrected, and now everything is controlled at the very top with the steering committee, with the Speaker's office, and as an individual member of Congress, you have very little ability to get anything done. The authorizing committees are at the mercy of the appropriations committees. I'm on one of the rare authorizing committees that works, the Armed Services Committee. We actually do our work every single year. But this year, look at the fact that we are going to be voting on a defense appropes bill next Tuesday or Wednesday, Thursday. At the same time, we'll be doing an all day and all night markup of the defense authorization bill, right? That doesn't make sense. We should be authorizing prior to the appropriations bill. And so that is, the power has been tightly concentrated at the top of Congress, and the committee system has broken down, and therefore we sort of careen from continuing resolution to continuing resolution, or an omnibus bill that nobody reads, or from shutdown to shutdown, and that's just not, as the old saying goes, a good way to run a railroad.
Now, you just previewed a lot of the themes of the piece, and we'll get back to those. I wanted to ask you next about what spurred you to write this article, but actually I think I probably should just ask a more fundamental question. What spurred you to run for Congress? You'd had a long service for the country in the military. You'd worked on Capitol Hill. You could have done a lot of things. What spurred you to go back to the Badger State and run for Congress?
So I left the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and moved home to work on a presidential campaign, actually, when Governor Walker ran for president. I was his national security advisor. It was interesting. I never worked on a campaign before, never really had any political experience, and I sort of came from the foreign policy national security committee in D.C., and there I was, writing draft foreign affairs articles, thinking, if only we can get this foreign affairs article published, we're really going to win this election, which obviously was not the case. So it was a great learning experience about sort of what you think matters from a policy perspective, and then what actually resonates in a political context. And then obviously the 2016 election cycle was incredibly unpredictable. And so I found myself without a job back in Wisconsin with no real desire to go back to D.C. Quite honestly, I didn't think there would be an opportunity to work in a Republican administration on foreign policy. And so finished my PhD and then worked in the private sector and was just in Green Bay, sort of starting a new chapter where I was going to do private sector and then teach at the local university when my congressman unexpectedly retired. And some people reached out to see if I'd be interested in running. And at first, I just didn't think my skill set would transfer that well. I didn't have any experience raising money. I'd never been in front of a camera before. I was a real kind of foreign policy geek. But then I sort of thought about it as an extension of what I was doing in the military and the intelligence community and thought, why not? Why not try and bring the perspective that I have to the legislative branch? And as a younger as a younger person running for office, I very much felt like I could inject a fresh perspective. And that, and I was otherwise unemployable. So Congress was the last option. But and then your second question was, how did the piece come about?
Yeah, so you get elected.
Yeah.
You come to Congress, and 2 years later you're writing this piece saying, I've been here now for 2 years. I see some real problems. And you said the problem isn't so much. It's not a problem of people. It's a problem of the institution.
Yeah. So that's what I came in with, the hypothesis that, and I kind of ran on this in many ways, that it was the people that were in Congress that were the source of the problem, right? Congress was just a bunch of careerists or charlatans or people that weren't that smart. And if only we can get new people in, that we would fix the problem. But then I come to realize that Congress has always been a mix of different people, right? If you read the introduction or the preface to Alan Drury's Advise and Consent, and he talks about this beautifully, about how Congress has always been a mix of, some people that shouldn't be there, some people that do want to be there for the right reasons, and we somehow manage always to get by. And so, and indeed, I think our government is built on a recognition that human beings are weird creatures, right? They do some interesting things, and therefore, best to have some checks and balances and sort of recognize that for what it is. So over my first years in Congress, I started to realize that I was wrong about my diagnosis of the problem, and that even if you got the best people to run for Congress, if they were forced to work in an institution that was this dysfunctional, they would get crushed. I mean, Mattis used to say, 9 times out of 10, when good people meet bad process wins out. And so I changed my hypothesis, and I started to think about...
That's Jim Mattis that said
Jim
that?
Mattis,
Okay.
yeah, or at least, I seem to remember a meeting where he said that. He's kind of like Bismarck now, where if you just don't know who actually said something, you attribute it to
That's right. Mark
Churchill,
Twain.
Bismarck, or Mattis,
Right.
said. But actually, the article happened when I have a niece and nephew that are 5 and 7, respectively, and I use them as an excuse to watch Pixar movies that I secretly like. And I was watching Monsters, Inc. with them at one point, and I had this realization. I'm like, Congress is like Monsters, Inc. And I was trying to explain it to them, and they didn't get what I was talking about. And I was like, you don't get it. Like, all you see is when the scary monster is on TV trying to scare you and affect you emotionally one way, but behind the scenes, it's Mike and Sully at the water cooler just talking about their job. And that really is kind of, what you see on TV is not actually the conversations that are happening on the House and the Senate floor. And so I wrote this op-ed originally called Congress, Inc. And it was all about, it was this dumb attempt to explain Monsters, Inc. and relate it to Congress. And I thought it was brilliant. And I sent it to my best friend, and he said, first of all, Monsters, Inc. is not ubiquitous enough of a cultural phenomenon where anyone would understand what you're talking about. And it also, the analogy cheapens what's an otherwise sort of important argument about Congress. So he's like, I think you have some interesting insights in here, but just make the piece about Congress and what you've observed as a freshman. And so I threw away all the Monsters, Inc. stuff, and I built that out over time, and then found someone who was willing to publish it, and went through a round of edits. And
So the point of the thrust of your piece is that Congress isn't doing its job, and it's not doing its job because of the way it's organized itself. But first, what do you see as Congress's job?
Yeah, so I think this was actually I had a whole section on that in an earlier version of the piece, before those editors ruined everything. But I think you got to identify a few things, right? I mean, perhaps most obviously, one, conduct oversight of the executive branch to make sure that the executive branch is doing the things it should be doing according to the law, to make sure that we are investing money in things that we should be investing money in, and that we aren't funding failure repeatedly, right? So just Congress acting as some sort of check on the executive branch and keeping it in its lane is one sort of obvious task for Congress. 2, it strikes me that Congress has certain mandatory responsibilities under the Constitution, right? We can identify regulating commerce with foreign nations as one of those, which we have surrendered to the executive branch, I would argue to you. The tariff debate is a good illustration of that. Providing for the common defense is a mandatory responsibility of the federal government writ large, but there's certain sort of constitutional functions you could carve out. And then third, I would say Congress is really the only body that we have at the federal level that is supposed to adjudicate disagreements, right? So you want Congress to be some sort of deliberative body that is debating with an eye towards arriving at policy, I don't want to say compromise, but legislative fixes to problems that need to be fixed. So those are sort of the 3 lines of effort I would identify. I have some conservative friends that would say nothing is the answer to what Congress should be doing. But I don't think it's doing any of those things effectively right now. We're having sort of what I refer to as kind of kabuki theater debates. And I say that's sort of an insult to kabuki theater because in theater, people at least take the time to memorize the lines,
right.
Whereas in Congress, you just sort of read from the paper. We legislate occasionally, but it's rarely the result of a deliberative process, and it rarely is actually legislation on, I think, the most important issues that we face. Indeed, when the rare moment arises when one party has control of all 3 branches of government, they sort of hastily jam through, and we're guilty of this too, as much legislation as we can on the big issues, but obviously we, if you care about the debt, for example, we're not really tackling Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the drivers of our debt. And then on the oversight piece, which is related, listen, I try and show up to my hearings. I just would ask you to conduct an experiment. Turn on C-SPAN, just watch some of these oversight hearings. Invariably, you'll see very few members of Congress at the hearings. If they're there, they'll pop in and they'll read something that's been written for them, and then they'll pop back out. I think it's fair to say that most members of Congress don't actually have an understanding of what the executive branch is and isn't doing. Yeah. And I don't mean there's a criticism of my colleagues and to suggest that I'm somehow smarter. I'm not. Given how big the executive branch is right now, it would be impossible with the resources you're given as a member of Congress to have a thorough understanding of what the executive branch is doing. Exhibit A, the oceanic acidification efforts that are underway right now that no one had a clue were underway until 10 a.m. this morning when we voted on it.
The title was sort of amusing. What was the title again? It was the Oceanic
Acidification
Innovation
Research Act. By the way, I'm gonna, my Twitter feed is going to be flooded with like oceanic acidification researchers that hate me now. I'm not.
Well, the first time I heard it,
I'm sure there's worthy efforts underway to de-acidify the ocean. Or,
the first time you mentioned it, I heard the word innovation, and I thought, well, I hope they're not innovating more ways to acidify the ocean. That seems like a bad idea.
That's right.
But so you tick through a few things there, right? Congress writes laws. I mean, the Senate also has a role in appointments, right? The House doesn't. But the House writes laws. It funds.
Forgot about the Senate.
It funds government, and then it oversees the activities of the other branches of government.
Yeah.
But it seems to me more and more the emphasis is all on that last thing, oversight.
Yeah.
Right? The Congress is increasingly a reactive body that waits for the executive branch to take action, and then it weighs in almost like an ombudsman.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe the border wall debates from earlier this year is a good example. It's true Congress was working on legislating, but there's always an eye to the White House and whether the president might just take unilateral action, and then Congress could sort of react accordingly. Am I right that Congress is putting maybe disproportionate, I don't want to say disproportionate effort into oversight because oversight's important, but the mix of legislation versus oversight seems to me to be a little, it seems to be off.
I think you're right to suggest that it's primarily a reactive body. Or even when there is collaboration between the executive branch and the legislative branch on how to advance legislation, I think it happens in the wrong way. And by the way, take all of this with a massive grain of salt. I've been in Congress for a total of 2 years and change, so I could be wrong about all this. It just strikes me, and part of the reason I wrote this is that everyone is complaining about Congress, not just the American people, but the members of Congress themselves. And yet we just keep doing things the same way. Or we think that if we can just get the right people in there, it'll change. But when there is collaboration, it happens in the form of, Trump will meet with Schumer, Pelosi, McConnell, and McCarthy, and they'll try and hammer out a budget deal at the White House. And think about that. The rest of us are sitting back in Congress sort of waiting for white smoke to emerge from the White House saying, we have a deal, right? We have a pope. No, like that, it's supposed to start with the committee process, right? It's supposed to start from the bottom up. You're supposed to pass 12 separate appropriations bills that should have been preceded by authorization bills, but that's not the way. It happens from a top-down perspective. And then I will say, however, there is some interesting reaction happening in Congress right now that I actually think is healthy. Yeah. So, for example, my biggest regret in my first term, the vote I wish I could take back was I voted for a rule. If you're in the majority, rule number 1 is don't vote against the rule, right? The rule is the rules in the Rules Committee are the way in which the majority maintains control of the House floor, i.e. the Speaker. So don't vote against the rule. You're said that 1,000 times. You're told that 1,000 times. I voted against a rule that basically took a War Powers Resolution disapproval that Ro Khanna had introduced in the last Congress and stripped it of its privileged status until the end of Congress. That's a fancy way of saying we basically ran out the clock on this so that the Congress wouldn't pass a disapproval that would find its way to the president's desk, which it eventually did in this Congress. So for the first time in the history of the War Powers Resolution since 1973, the president had to veto a disapproval resolution, a joint resolution of disapproval. I voted against that disapproval resolution because I would vote to authorize assistance to the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen because of my views on the way in which we need to be engaged in the region. However, I should not have voted against us having that debate. I think that was actually one of the more healthy things this Congress has done. I think that was a long overdue flexing of some constitutional muscles that hasn't happened in a long time. So you're seeing a similar debate play out right now in response to the Trump administration's decision to declare an emergency in order to approve an arms sale to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And you examine the history, this goes back to the 70s and revisions to the Arms Export Control Act. It has only happened 3 times before. So there's some, I guess I'm saying, Congress is reacting to the president, but there's some healthy reaction happening right now.
Well, in terms of constructive reforms, and that really is the core of your piece, let's talk about the 3 reforms you focus on. You already alluded to them somewhat. The first one I don't think you brought up yet is just changing the calendar, changing the way in which members of Congress spend time in Washington, D.C. and spend time in their districts at home. The second is changing the committee chair selection process. And then the third is just streamlining the structure of committees and their jurisdiction, including this question about appropriations and authorization. Can we just take those in order? Can we start with the calendar?
Sure. So right after this, I'll get on a flight and I'll fly back to Wisconsin, and then I'll, fly back here on Sunday evening or Monday morning. And so, your average week in D.C. is about 2 to 3 days of legislative time that's incredibly frenetic. And I would venture to say that, if not a majority, a strong plurality of that time is actually not spent doing legislative work. In many cases, it's spent doing fundraising work. My understanding in talking to the parliamentarians and trying to do some research with CRS on this issue is that this really, the change in the schedule really accelerated in the 90s under Republicans. And one of the theories was, you have to go back to your district every weekend. Don't move your families here because it'll appear as though you're a creature of D.C. and you'll get primaried, right? This is purely a political thing. So the unintended consequence of that was, people lost time that they need to do their actual job of legislating and oversight. 2, people stopped developing real human relationships. Their families weren't here on the weekends. They just didn't get to know each other. And then 3, and related, the calendar now exists, I think, to allow members to raise as much money as possible for re-election. So I think changing that makes a lot of sense. One proposal that is being considered now by the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, led by Derek Kilmer, is doing a 2-on, 2-off. I'd prefer a 3-on, 1-off, but even that would be better, right? 2 weeks where we're actually in session, at least 5 days a week, where people are here, and then you can have 2 weeks back in your district. You'd save money because you wouldn't be flying as much. You get more productive time here in D.C. You'd actually get more productive time back in your district. Even if you did 3 to 1, you'd get more productive time back in your district. I get back on a Thursday night. I work all day Friday, all day Saturday, and then Sunday I go to church, and then I fly back. It's just not, it makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah, and I think key to all of this is it would change the nature of your relationship with people in Washington and people in D.C. Instead of these sort of frenetic exchanges, you'd spend time with your colleagues, even across the aisle, and then you'd spend more extended time with your constituents back at home.
The transition would be hard, though, because there would be this great moment if everyone was here, let's say for 3 weeks straight. They really wouldn't have anything to do right away, right? Because you'd have to change the way the floor works and the committees work to actually force them to not spend all their time here twiddling their thumbs. So it's one reform that would have to be coupled with some others to actually reinvigorate the legislative
We could send you on some team building exercises. Yeah, that's right. You all do a ropes course.
Trust falls and.
But actually, there's a practical issue here, the housing issue.
Yeah.
Right. D.C. is an expensive place to live. Suddenly, there would need to be a way for members of Congress, especially the ones who aren't independently wealthy, to have some sort of a comfortable, living situation, while at the same time not having the taxpayer sort of subsidize lavish lifestyles in D.C.
One thing you could do is, right now, members either live in their office or I'm in a row house with a bunch of other members of Congress. That's like a bad sitcom. You could allow members to use a portion of their MRA, their office funds. You wouldn't actually increase the amount of money. It would be money they're not spending on franking, money they're not spending on on staff pay up to a certain limit, right? Like tag it to what your average O3, lower ranking military officer is given for a housing allowance in the DC area, and apply that for their housing costs. Even that there would be an outcry among the American people, but there's ways to do it.
Okay, the second one was changing the committee's chair selection process.
Yeah. So basically, I don't know if most people know how this works. So your committee assignments are dictated by the steering committee. It is roughly 18 people that are the most powerful members of the House. The Speaker gets 4 votes, the Majority Leader gets 2 votes, and then everyone else gets 1 vote. I think that's roughly accurate. The Democrats may have a little different system, but it's roughly the same. So after you get elected, in order to get on the committees you want, you have to go basically campaign to the steering committee to get their votes, to get put on the committee. And then if you want to sort of trade up to get on a more valuable committee, and usually that's determined by how much money you can raise from being on that committee, you have to prove yourself to have been a team player, right? You both through your voting record and the amount of money that you've given to the party, to the NRCC, right? This is just the way in which leadership exercises authority, right? This is how they maintain or attempt to maintain discipline. But the steering committee and leadership also chooses who gets to be committee chairs. And think about how that process works. If you are ambitious, if you want to be a committee chair one day, all of your incentives are to sort of play the steering committee game. Vote always with party leadership and make sure that you are giving enough money, forking enough money over to the NRCC. There's literally a scoring card that you're evaluated on based on this, right? There's no score for whether or not you've actually mastered the issues on that committee, whether you've proven yourself to be an effective legislator. That's just not how it works. And again, this is part of that overall effort over the last few years whereby power has become tightly controlled at the top. I think by changing that, by instead requiring committee chairs to be elected by the members of the committee, you could possibly, at least what I would be trying to do, is to devolve power and authority back to the committees themselves. And my theory is that if your committee chairs are elected by the members of the committee, the incentives will change. If you're a member of the committee and you want to be a committee chair one day, you'll have to prove to the existing committee chair and to your colleagues on the committee that you're a productive citizen of that committee. If you're a committee chair that wants to stay in power, we have term limits for committee chairs in the Republican caucus, by the way, you have to prove that you are attentive to the needs of your members and that you can make the legislative process work. So that's the theory behind it. I will say I got principled pushback from one person, and that is Paul Ryan, who argued that the risk of that new system would be that it opens it up to more special interest capture, right? So if committee chairs want to stay in power, then they would just placate the members of the committee by, funding all the priorities that are in that bill. Now, I would argue that the current process is completely captured in many ways by special interest, but we can have that debate. But I just want to acknowledge that counter-argument because I actually think it's the best one I've encountered so far.
What about 2 more? One is that the committees themselves really have no existence separate from Congress. They're agents of Congress as a whole. And so ultimately, the committee, not just the committee's chair, but the committee as a whole, should answer to Congress as a whole, in terms of the majority, so the majority party.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. I think the committee should answer to Congress as a whole in the form of Congress voting on issues that the committee advances, right? Yeah. And then members who are not on that committee should have an opportunity to submit amendments to bills. Yeah. And that doesn't happen right now, right? So the committees either won't authorize in the first place, or the appropriators will put policy riders on their bills that do the work of authorizing committees. And then every rule we pass to structure debate on a bill basically prevents real amendments and debate from happening. And so I don't know. I think that's why you'd also have to pair it with a reform which Pelosi actually agreed to something like this, where if a bill has a certain amount of co-sponsors, it would automatically get get a hearing in committee and could automatically be brought to the Rules Committee for a debate.
And the other objection might be just one of practicality.
Yeah.
Right. That the House, being such a large body, just needs strong centralized leadership.
Yeah.
In the same way that the executive branch has one president who oversees everything, right? You read books like Robert Caro's Master of the Senate, and that's a much smaller body,
Sure.
right? But the theme being the Senate didn't accomplish anything until Lyndon Johnson came in and really knew how to lead it and manage it. And what's difficult for the Senate would be even more difficult from the House unless it has this strong centralized leadership. This leadership that we have now, it came about for a reason, and the reason was making Congress more productive.
Well, it'd be interesting to tease out the argument of, is the problem actually the reverse of what I'm saying, that leadership actually isn't as powerful as it needs to be, right? Mm-hmm. That with the emergence of things like the Freedom Caucus, they don't have control. Mm-hmm. I don't think that argument holds up. I think right now we are in a situation where all the power redounds to the Speaker and other members of leadership. So I think we are in a strong centralized paradigm right now, and the results are obviously bad. So I think the most obvious thing we could do is to reverse that trend and embark on a different experiment. So in other words, like, let's just start making some original mistakes here. Not the same ones over and over again.
And then the last one was changing the committees themselves, streamlining their jurisdiction, and also changing the relationship between the subject matter committees and the Appropriations Committee.
Yeah.
Why don't you walk through that?
So this is interesting, and I'm not saying I'm some sort of expert on congressional history. You know, I spent a good deal of time trying to do research for this article and talking to the parliamentarians and other congressional experts. And as I understand it, and I'm sure there's probably someone in this audience who actually knows this stuff and is going to tell me I'm wrong, but the division between appropriations committees and authorizing committees goes back to the days of when John Quincy Adams was in Congress. And at the time, it was sort of to prevent an issue where a situation where you'd have a government shutdown, right? Like you want to separate the funding of the government function from some of the other policy functions that Congress undertakes, which makes some sense. And then there's been periods of time where those authorities have been combined, and the result has been a massive increase in government spending. So I think it was a well-intentioned idea, but in the modern day, I think it's actually that separation itself that is at the source of our dysfunction. Now, let me disclose my bias. I'm not on the Appropriations Committee. I'm on an authorizing committee, right? But I think most authorizers would concede the fact that, I mean, there's an old joke in Congress that appropriators run everything, right? Or I should say appropriations staffers run everything, right? So think about it. You know, think about how many programs we're funding right now that have not been authorized. I forget what the actual number is or the dollar value of this right now, but it's actually quite significant. Think about how long the State Department has gone without an authorization. So in other words, we're sort of spending money on things, and we haven't said that we are allowed to spend money on things, right? And you can be an authorizer and spend all your time passing a bill, and then the appropriators can say, okay, thank you for your interest in national security. Now go home, we're going to do something else, right? I encountered this when I was a staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where we spent about a year in the wake of the coup in Egypt. We weren't calling it a coup at the time. Revising our very complex foreign assistance program to Egypt, and then we actually got it passed out of the Foreign Relations Committee, and then the appropriators took it and just did something completely different, completely ignored our work, right? So I think that basically the net result of that is members who want to partake in the legislative process get very disillusioned and quickly realize that in order to get anything through, they have to wait to the moment when a moving vehicle is happening, either an appropriations bill or the National Defense Authorization Act, and try and jam their pet initiative onto it. And so I think it's incredibly dysfunctional. And a system that would make far more sense to me is if you collapse the appropriations function into the authorizing committee. So that would make every single committee more powerful, right? And it's not obvious to me that you would want to separate those functions, because at the end of the day, you just want members of Congress who are on those committees who understand those issues, right? So if I'm spending a lot of time trying to understand what the Pentagon is doing as a member of the Armed Services Committee, wouldn't that make me ideally suited to also determine how much money we should be spending on Pentagon initiatives? Yeah. It's one and the same, in my opinion. And so you make each committee more powerful, and therefore you make the work of each member of Congress more meaningful. And that's the whole idea here. And I don't know if I've gotten it right, but I just agree with Yuval Levin's analysis, and I think you've got to find a way to channel the natural ambition of everyone who's going to run and be a member of Congress. That's not going to go away. into the legislative process, away from fundraising, away from Fox News and MSNBC, into the legislative process. It may be impossible, and I may have missed the mark in the 3 reforms I'm proposing, but that's the idea behind it.
Well, I think this last reform is really crucial, especially the point on funding. I mean, as somebody who works on regulatory issues and studies the administrative state, you know, I keep going back to Madison, but Madison says that the most powerful tool that people have...
Mattis or Madison?
Madison.
Okay.
Mattis probably said it too. But Madison said, only because he got there first before Mattis could, that Mattis just rejoined us, by the way, as a senior fellow, so we really enjoy talking about him here.
That's good.
That the power of the purse is the most effectual tool Congress has, the people have, to keep in check the other parts of government.
Yeah.
Right? So I think aligning appropriations with the oversight function and legislative function is key. But the downside to it, though, is when each committee now has a driving role in appropriations and funding on that one specific issue, then you don't have sort of the centralized view over Congress's spending as a whole.
Yeah.
Right? So you have to, Congress has to work extra hard to guard against each committee in sort of an arms race of spending.
That's a great point.
Trying to spend more and more.
So the proposal that Nunes and some others have put forward in the past, and I just didn't have time to go into it, but it exists out there, is you basically, the budget committee still exists, but it becomes populated by the chairs and the ranking members of all of the newly empowered committees. And so that sort of super committee would still determine overall funding levels. I mean, right now, the budget committee, I mean, we didn't pass a budget resolution this year. I mean, the budget, basically we passed the Budget Control and Empowerment Act, or the Budget Empowerment and Control Act in '74, and then just haven't done that in a responsible way ever since. So you have to simultaneously empower the budget committee to actually act as that overall adjudicator between the committees. So it gets very complicated. I also think biannual budgeting would be a useful reform to pair with this, so we sort of budget on a 2-year cycle. But the other thing that's in that is simplifying the overall committee structure as well, right? So the last very productive period of congressional reform, as I understand it, was in the mid to late 40s. It was led by Wisconsinite Bob Lafayette Jr., and what they did was take a bunch of committees and simplify the structure and create clear lines of authority and lanes in the road. And so I think it's time for a similar effort today to sort of take a look at the committee structure and take a look at the executive branch structure and find a way to get them to align more closely. Find a way where in certain policy areas like healthcare, where this is particularly egregious, where jurisdiction is shared across 7 committees and who knows how many subcommittees, and create a single House Health Committee, as was proposed by the 1973 Bowling Commission, as was re-proposed by the 1980 Patterson Commission. So this is not a new idea. So in addition to simplifying appropriations and authorization, there's other efforts you could undertake to simplify the overall committee structure that I think would result in better oversight.
Just one more reform idea came to mind during the conversation. In the 90s and onward, Congress was in the business of cutting its own resources. Congress wanted to cut federal spending, and it led by example by tightening its own belts.
Yeah.
Is it time to rethink that? Because you said earlier that it's impossible for Congress to really keep up with the modern administrative state, given how many things it does, how big it is. Is it time for Congress to invest more in its own sort of legislative and oversight capacities, precisely in order to make it a better first branch?
I think so. I voted for proposals to kind of restore a version of the Office of Technical Assessment, which was eliminated in the 90s. I think staffing was cut by at least a third in the 90s going forward. That was self-defeating. I can understand, right? It sort of sounds like a drain the swampy type thing, but I would argue it's actually the opposite of what you would want to do, the drain the swamp, because it just gives further power to unelected executive branch bureaucrats. What's interesting is I've almost come to believe that getting rid of earmarks has done exactly the same thing. And I got to believe there's a way to restore congressionally directed spending while also guarding against some of the most egregious abuses we saw with the use of earmarks. So I do. I mean, what the number is, I don't know if we want a 2x congressional staffing. It wouldn't really make a dent on our overall deficit or debt at all. I think that would be a very good investment. And then the final thing I'd say is particularly, I was an intel guy in the military. Our ability to use classified information in Congress is abysmal. Now, it may be because Congress has such a terrible record of leaking. And it's kind of weird to me that if you're elected, you automatically get a TS-SCI. But in order to consume classified information, I mean, we are at such a disadvantage from the executive branch when it comes to intelligence and classified information, because you literally have to walk or get on a little train to go to the Capitol, and there's no dedicated, computers in your office that would allow you to access intelligence information. So it'd be interesting to think about, could you, I'm not saying like put Congress in the business of collecting intelligence information, but give it a more robust way to access classified information, or even just open source intelligence, which it doesn't have right now.
Well, we have time left for one or two questions from the audience.
I talked too much, sorry.
There's a couple of microphones.
Yeah.
Why don't we start right here, and then the second question will be right there.
Judge Kavanaugh has put a big emphasis on the administrative state, and that raises the whole question of how law cases in the judiciary can be dealing with exactly the theme you've been talking about all morning. So I wonder if you could, though you're not a lawyer, I wonder if you could make any observations on how the judicial side of this correction of the administrative state could work, or add to your campaign, I guess, what I'm asking.
Wow.
And the next question will be right here.
Sure. Yeah. Are we going right to the
No,
second
you can
question?
go ahead.
Okay. I'll be honest, I haven't really thought a lot about that. I mean, I do think when we pass bad legislation, or, legislation that basically says, as Obamacare did, I think 1,000 or more than 3,000 times, the Secretary shall or the Secretary may, or basically that are just massive grants of authority to the executive branch, we then allow the third branch of government to get involved and for all this stuff to be adjudicated in the courts. In fact, I just read an article today saying that this practice of judges sort of issuing an injunction is actually a very modern practice. That used to only, like a nationwide injunction, right?
Yep.
I actually didn't know that. Like that's an interesting problem to me. So I don't have a good answer to your question. I defer to the lawyer on the panel here. For what
well, I'll defer to the next question, but I've got some law review articles you ought to read on nationwide injunctions.
Good.
The second question.
I can't even fix one branch, let alone
you have time.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the third question will be there.
Henry Sokolsky with the Non-Proliferation Policy
Good to see you again,
Education Center.
Henry. Absolutely.
Last time we were speaking about whether Eisenhower was as good as you thought.
Yeah.
I am not going to waste my question on that.
Yeah.
They say charity starts at home. Dan Quayle tried to do what you're doing. He didn't get very far. I'm hoping you get further. But what if you could only do something to improve your own office? We've already heard that you want a better apartment. That's good.
Yeah.
What else would you do? Would you hire more staff?
Yeah.
What kind of staff? The next question is, do you have any enthusiasm for figuring out how to stop televising hearings? And third, is there anything non-governmental organizations like my own or the Hoover could do to help you?
Yeah. So great questions. If I had a magic wand and I had more resources at my disposal, the first thing I would do is hire more staff, just to help me deal with the legislative complexity. I sort of went into this arrogantly thinking that I was like a somewhat intelligent person. I have a bunch of fancy degrees. I used to get paid to tell senators what to think about issues. But it is so hard. I mean, you're just doing triage every single day. I think a related version of that, and I don't know how to do this, but if I could wave a magic wand, I would find a way to spend 0 hours of my day focused on political fundraising. 0. I mean, if there were a way to get out of this constant re-election cycle, that would be the best thing I could possibly do, because that would mean I would have more time to focus on what I'm focusing on. I mean, right now I'm co-chairing a commission on U.S. cyber policy with Senator Angus King. It is awesome. It is an opportunity to do some serious work in an otherwise unserious Congress, but it is a struggle to carve out the time necessary. I mean, think about that. That is a complex topic, right? I mean, very difficult. And so to kind of get to your second question on cameras, we were in a meeting of that commission this week, and someone, I won't identify them, said, I am both sad and happy. I'm happy because we just had a 2-hour fantastic debate and discussion, and I really learned a lot. I'm sad because we never have those types of discussions in Congress. It almost never happens. And the reason it never happens is because the cameras are always rolling, right? The cameras are always on. And I think this started in the 70s, right? There was these sunshine. Oh, it was in the 90s. Okay.
No, Gingrich in the 80s, you mean, right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So let's get rid of, let's get rid of the cameras. I'm fine with that. But then you had everyone tweeting and on their phones. And what can Hoover do to help? You guys do fantastic work. I do think this is a problem with all think tanks right now. Even when I was a staffer, I was the Middle East staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It was hard for me, and I just had some recent tactical experience in the Middle East. It was hard for me to keep up with all the stuff that was coming out of think tanks on just that region of the world. I didn't have time to read all this stuff. And so finding a way to make your research, which is incredibly important, I'm not saying dumb it down or dilute it, but to also just make it very targeted at legislators. And really, if you have a 20-page white paper on, nuclear proliferation policy, for example, at least having sort of a one-page at the end that says, and this is what it means in terms of where you need to legislate going forward. I think all think tanks need to do a little bit better job of having work that is ready for legislative action. Some do it better than others, and Hoover is absolutely phenomenal. You've hired some of my most favorite people, but if that makes sense, I think that's an area where all think tanks can help out more.
And we're up against time. One last question real quick.
Yeah. So a lot of your reforms are geared towards refocusing the ambition and interests of legislators towards actual legislation, but currently they're focused right now mostly on getting reelected, particularly in the House. So I'm wondering, A, how you make the case for these reforms to the electorate, the people who elected officials care most about, and B, if that is even necessary for these reforms to kind of take place.
Yeah, so that's a great question. What fascinates me about the current moment is I actually think these issues are the easiest to talk about with the electorate, right? I mean, they span the ideological spectrum. I just gave a speech at the last 2 years I spoke at something called Unrig the System, which is a conference on political reform. I would say 99% of the people there were highly progressive. They probably hate my positions on, take your pick. And they probably hate the Hoover Institution, too. That's probably unfairly.
No.
Who could hate the Hoover Institution? Come on.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah. But on this, we were speaking the same language. And I think part of the reason I did well in my reelection was because I spent so much time focused on reform. And if you look at all the major periods of congressional reform that were successful, they were preceded by a period of profound disgust with the institution. And I would submit to you that we are at that moment right now. I just met with a former member in my office this morning, and he said, and who was in from 2000 to 2006, and he said, when I was in Congress, we had a 50% approval rating, and we thought that was bad. Now we're at like 10%. So I think it's only a matter of time. I'm actually surprised that I think the president would do well to go back to some of the stuff he talked about in his Gettysburg speech towards the end of the last election. I think reform issues, they may seem kind of weird and inside the beltway, but if you talk about them the right way, they can be pretty politically potent, and you can get a lot of people interested. I would say this article, which I just thought was kind of a way to stay sane, I got a bigger response from that than anything else I've ever done. Now, maybe that's a bad reflection on everything else I'm doing, but I think it's because of the topic, right? People are really interested in this stuff. I mean, we should demand a legislature that works better than it does right now. I mean, we have strayed far from the framers' vision, and correcting that strikes me as perhaps the most important task that faces our country right now.
Well, this article is a very eloquent statement on that, and if you haven't already read it, I really encourage you to look it up in the Atlantic Monthly. But we really appreciate also you taking the time to come here and talk a little bit more about these themes, and we wish you luck as you work forward on these things.
Thank you. I'm sorry I talked so much.
No. Please join me in thanking the congressman. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.